So thrilled to start our first plenary session of today. If you're keeping score from yesterday, we're actually on number 4. We have three fantastic speakers and a discussant. The first is Jack Goncalo. He's from the University of Illinois, also a Berkeley PhD, I might add. Ethan Burris is here from the University of Texas at Austin, and Jeff Polzer will round out the slate from Harvard Business School. Jeff.
Good morning. Is this going? Thanks, Jenny and Samir, for inviting me. And I must say I really enjoyed the first day. I learned so much about how culture is sort of conceptualized and discussed in other areas. So it's been really informative. I was asked to talk about the connection between social norms and team creativity, which is a topic that I've been thinking a lot about over the last 10 to 15 years. So I'm not going to present a really focused empirical project, but rather a sort of overview of what we've learned, not just myself, but others working in this area, about how social norms sort of shape the process of being creative in a collaborative way. And this is a particularly important topic for two reasons. One is that creativity is increasingly being recognized as an important source of competitive advantage for most organizations. I don't think that particularly this crowd has to be convinced of the importance of being creative as a way of making organizations more competitive. The novel and appropriate solutions to problems that organizations generate can lead to profit and can lead to competitive advantage. The other trend that has taken place over the last 20 years or so is that creative work is being done less and less as a lone individual and more as a collaborative act as a member of a team. So most of the time when creativity is unfolding in organizations, it is doing so in the context of a team-based environment. But the problem is that team creativity has proven to be quite tricky. And the mere fact of collaboration introduces a number of barriers that can prevent groups from being creative. The first is that when I put people together as part of a team, there can be a conversational bottleneck. So we can't all speak at once. So while I'm waiting for my turn to speak, sometimes I forget what my ideas were, and we lose ideas in a process sort of loss kind of way. The second is that when I put an individual in a team, sometimes we can worry about what other people think of us. And so because I fear rejection, I fear that other people aren't going to like my ideas, people tend to withhold their most novel ideas and instead share their most mundane ideas to avoid criticism. And finally, one of the facts of life of teamwork is often that teams make us lazy. So if I put people into a team, there can be this sort of social loafing effect in which I feel like, well, no one's really carefully tracking exactly how much I'm contributing, so I can sort of pull back and not suggest so many ideas. And there have been a number of different solutions suggested to solve these problems, most of which have revolved around creating these formal rules, like the brainstorming rules that many of us are familiar with. So one example would be do not criticize, to alleviate this sort of level of evaluation apprehension. The problem is that these rules have had very mixed success. So one example, a few colleagues and I conducted a study in which we actually reversed the brainstorming rules, and we found no discernible impact on creative output. So you can tell people criticize, don't criticize, do this, do that, whatever. The rules really had no impact on how successfully people collaborated to be creative. So this raises a couple of questions. One is that are 3 heads actually worse than 1? When you put people together, are you actually getting less out of each individual than if you had them work alone? And then second, what might the solution be to getting people to collaborate successfully in teams? Now, one possibility is using social norms as a tool to regulate this process. But this notion has been quite controversial because of a very influential perspective in the creativity literature, which suggests that social norms are somehow inherently stifling of the creative process. So social norms are these informal guidelines and expectations that guide and regulate individual behavior in teams. So these are things that we agree upon, and they reduce uncertainty, and they make behavior more predictable, and they constrain the variety of behaviors that you would expect to observe in a team. And according to this perspective, because creativity requires wide latitude to deviate from shared expectations, it allows, you would presumably more creativity would happen when you feel permission to deviate, to say things that are different, controversial, that in fact social control should inherently stifle creativity. So precisely because social norms make behavior more predictable, more regulated, more constrained, that somehow social norms should be inherently stifling of creativity. And so it's not surprising, actually, that the main proponents of this are actually at Berkeley, and I think of this as sort of an anarchistic sort of view of the creative process. But I want to actually give you a different view that has emerged in the creativity literature over the last decade or so, which views social norms not as an inherently constraining element of the creative process, but one that can be actually a tool that you can leverage to regulate the creative process in groups and make creative ideas something that occurs with some regularity and predictability. So from this perspective, social norms aren't necessarily constraining. They're actually a tool that you can use to ensure that people are actually behaving in ways that are conducive to the creative process. So I want to make this argument in two steps. One is to talk about the actual norm content. So what are the behaviors that should be encouraged by norms in order to facilitate creativity in groups? And then second, should these norms be strong or weak? And this second point, as we'll see, has been the subject of the most controversy. So should we allow people to do whatever they want, or should we specify the normative expectations and then ensure that those expectations are followed with the threat of social sanctions? And so I'm going to sort of talk about these in two steps. With respect to norm content, the challenge here is that any and all behaviors that you can imagine in a team could be governed by social norms. So taking the stairs every morning on the way to work may relate to creativity, or putting your pants on one leg at a time, or washing your hands. So there's a huge universe of behaviors that might be relevant to the creative process. But our review of the literature actually found that they actually cohere around a fairly predictable set of 5 norms that constitute the peace framework that I'm going to talk about. And the norms are each relevant to the creative process in different ways. So I came up with an acronym to remember the norms because, as Jenny warned, I'm an academic and I tend to forget everything if I don't have the acronym. But the first norm that really matters is participation. So norms that ensure that everyone in the group participates equally. So we often find in teams that some people talk more than others, some people talk more loudly than others. I've done some research with colleagues showing that narcissistic people, even though they're not objectively more creative than other people, believe that they are, and so they contribute more to the group discussion. They talk more often, they interrupt people. But those people have to be curbed with norms that ensure that everyone on the team contributes equally. And one of the ways to do that is by ensuring that everyone feels as though their individual contributions are going to be rewarded proportionally. And so equity rules tend to make the participation norm salient, which in turn makes everybody participate in a more uniform way. And so this is a way of simply getting more ideas out on the table, and more people participating means more perspectives that are shared. The second step is that participation is not enough if people, when they share ideas, converge very quickly and conform to each other's opinions. So the next norm that matters is norms that encourage independence from the group. Norms that encourage independence allow people to stand out, to be different, to assert their uniqueness to others, indeed even be individualistic in the way that they relate to other people. And so some of my work and others has shown that that encouraging individualistic norms makes people not only share more ideas, but also ideas that are more divergent, ideas that stand out from others, ideas that take the group in a different direction. And so if you actually look at individualistic groups in conversation as they are generating ideas, they tend to say things like, well, that's a good idea, but I have one that's even better than that. So let me tell you about my idea. And so that kind of independence from the group really makes the group generate not only more ideas, but ideas that are more creative, more novel, and more divergent. The next norm that matters is the norm to elaborate on the ideas of others. And so some of us who have had toddlers and have observed them at play in a sandbox, this concept of parallel play doesn't really work too well in the context of creative collaboration. And so if you have a team where people are putting on blinders and focusing only on their own ideas and not paying attention to the ideas suggested by others, tend to realize less creative ideas than groups that encourage elaboration. So the goal is to not just focus on my own ideas, but to look for opportunities to build on the ideas of others, combine your ideas with other people's ideas, and eventually reach ideas that are better than any one individual could have come up with alone. Communication also matters, so creating an environment in which people feel safe to communicate in ways that that are respectful to each other also matters. And somewhat counterintuitively, Jenny and I have shown that a norm to be politically correct, even though it sounds inherently stifling, can reduce uncertainty and make people more comfortable sharing the novel ideas that would ordinarily generate criticism. And then finally, the norm to explore beyond the boundaries of the group also encourages creativity by permitting people to try things out, to test their ideas with outsiders, and that ends up making ideas more calibrated to end users. All right, so that's sort of the map of the content of the norms that seem to matter for the creative process. I want to turn now to the more controversial suggestion that strong norms can facilitate the creativity of groups. And so I just want to give you sort of the broad outline of an experiment that we did a few years ago in which we chose a creativity relevant norm. And then in the experiment, we actually made some people feel as though if they didn't follow this creativity relevant norm, that they would be kicked out of the group. So we did an activity in which people were supposed to vote on whether or not their fellow teammates embodied the appropriate norm to be independent from groups. And then we actually came back to the team and we said, well, your team voted, and it turns out that you were the least independent, individualistic person on the team. And so in order to help them, we're going to remove you and have you go into another room and work alone on this. And so it was a very socially awkward experimental manipulation. This is also why I love my job, maybe the only reason why I love my job. And so what we found was interesting. So when the norm to be individualistic was strong, so people had overt sanctions that threatened them if they didn't comply with this expectation, they ended up generating significantly more creative ideas in a subsequent task, in a subsequent brainstorming task. When the creativity inappropriate norm of being collectivistic was reinforced with social sanctions, it reduced creativity significantly. So not only does norm content matter, but also strengthening the norm seems to help groups do the appropriate kinds of behaviors that are going to facilitate the creative process. Weak norms really didn't pay much of a dividend. So when we said, you could be individualistic, but we'll let you decide, do whatever you want. This is merely a suggestion. It really didn't guide behavior in a way that was conducive to the free exchange of creative ideas. So this notion that social control is inherently stifling was not really supported by the results of this study. So a few key takeaways. One is that norms are not the enemy of the creative process. They are, in fact, a tool that we can use to ensure that creative ideas are expressed openly and regularly, and that these norms are not necessarily going to be potent influences on behavior unless they're activated by certain aspects of the social context. And again, the idea that social control is inherently stifling is not borne out by the research evidence that's been accumulating over many years now. And in fact, if you have identified creativity-relevant norms, it makes sense to reinforce those norms with the threat of ostracism from the group. Now, I will conclude by saying that I am burdened by the fact that this is day 2 and I have to grapple with some of the ideas that were shared yesterday, which include the idea that cultural looseness facilitates creativity and innovation. So I would love to hear from Jenny and Michelle about the potential distinctions between what it means to have a strong norm versus a tight culture. And thank you very much.
First of all, thank you very much to Samir and Jenny for having me out. Yesterday was wonderful, and looking forward to another great day today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a gentleman named Swampy. So he was an engineer at Boeing. He worked in process engineering and quality for near 30 years. And spent a majority of his time up in the Seattle area. Eventually made his way down to South Carolina, where he worked just outside of Charleston in their plant on the 737 MAX. And over the course of his couple years there, he noticed quite a few things that were troubling to him. So things like metal shavings that were left on some wires, general debris that was left within the airplane. And routinely, he spoke up about some of these issues and eventually was kind of given some feedback that he shouldn't do so. So he was moved to different parts of the manufacturing line. And on the surface, this may not seem like that big of a deal, because I don't know how much time y'all have spent in the inside of an airplane, but it's sort of a mess. There should be debris everywhere. There should be wiring. There should be metal shavings. But each of these issues can cause some massive problems if the metal shavings make their way inside the wires, which can short circuit those wires, et cetera. And Swampy's experience here was not really unique within Boeing. We had other folks that saw dented hydraulic tubes that were taken from the scrap bin and moved back into the manufacturing line for these airplanes. This senior manager told him, don't worry about it. He brought this up to HR, was told to submit this complaint via their standard processes over email, and then was later downgraded on his performance evaluation for doing so. We have folks who saw sealants and nuts and stuff in the build process make their way still within the airplane. They were fired for speaking up and getting this to the review board. And one thing I'll say after studying this for a number of years, these types of issues aren't unique to Boeing. This is Rob Ebeling, who is the engineer at NASA who spoke up about the Challenger space shuttle. Yesterday, Michael Morris was talking about Mary Barra, CEO of General Motors, who came in on the heels of their biggest recall. And she really attributed the reason for that to a general culture around the lack of speaking up within the workplace. And these are certainly, traumatic experiences here. But on the other side, there's grand successes for not only attending to these types of ideas from below, but trying to implement them. This is Paul Buckheit. So he tried to come up with a way to organize email way back when, and eventually this ended up becoming a product called Gmail. And a bank called Standard Chartered, instead of throwing a typical corporate anniversary party, they ended up paying attention to one of the ideas from their lower-level employees and launched a campaign that was called Seeing is Believing. And fast forward 20 years, they've raised over $100 million for this. So, there's opportunities to tap into employees' ideas from below, but that doesn't always happen. And a lot of these types of examples are nice academic examples, nice experiences, and I will say don't really hit home until you're on an airplane from, say, Austin, Texas to Oakland, California, and you look down and see what kind of airplane you're on. So I study what I call employee voice, what leads employees to speak up in organizations, how their managers respond to that feedback. And sort of the theory of the case here is that if organizations can take advantage of the insights from all levels of the organization, then those organizations can excel. And we started to see some accumulating evidence that this is actually the case. So it reduces turnover where employees feel like their ideas are actually used. If you implement them, you can see improvements in financial and operational performance. These are of financial service institutions. The crux of this, though, is even though these have the potential to increase the performance of organizations, routinely, people don't offer their feedback. Some of this is exactly what Jack was talking about before. There's that fear of ostracism that comes around. So in a couple different studies, we've seen that upwards of 70, 80, 90% of folks have felt hesitation in speaking up. And some of the data that we collected a little while back, we actually took every one of those ideas that employees gave on an open-ended survey, went back to the top executive teams for about a dozen different organizations and have them rate the novelty, feasibility, and overall quality. And among those that were rated the top 100 by the senior executive team is still that same 40% who told their manager. There's a pervasive lack of comfort in doing so. So why is this the case? So if you go to most of the literature on this, they really point to kind of two different mechanisms. As Jack pointed out before, this pervasive sense of fear that when you speak up, you'll be met with rejection or negative feedback to some of the performance evaluations that we saw before. So this is an individual from a financial service institution. A specific work problem we've been experiencing lately is when one person speaks their mind, they've been fired to move to a different branch. Obviously, if that's some of the reaction that you get, it kind of puts a damper on the overall culture. The second reason is a sense of futility. That is, even if you feel safe in speaking up, will it actually make a difference? Will it lead to implementation in some way? So the past 25, 30 years, the research in this has started to really understand these individual decisions of employees. Most of the reasons and factors look at individual decision-making. This is a recent review article by Elizabeth Morrison, and what we found there in coding these is well over 90% of the articles on here is about the one single individual employee. And we sort of ignore the fact that they're embedded in teams, that there's a culture that is influenced by leaders, and that this should make a difference in terms of the culture that is set. Secondly, there's also a lot of attention paid to the frequency by which people speak up and not really what it is they have to say. So the dynamics around speaking up around your tasks or the culture or diversity inclusion issues are materially different. And some of the things that should impact you speaking up about one type of topic versus the other should also be different as well. So we designed a study to start to get at this, and I'll walk through some of the basic building blocks of our thinking behind it, and then some of the data and at least preliminary analyses that we've been able to see. So our theory really rests on two different arguments. The first is that leaders matter. So leaders, their dispositions, their characteristics, their behaviors in the workplace affect the teams and especially the culture that they lead. And then secondly here, what leaders attend to, so their beliefs, the things they pay attention to in the workplace also impacts the types of ideas that they're going to pay attention to, and therefore the cultural values that those teams have. So one is leaders impact culture, and then second, who leaders interact with should impact the things that they pay attention to. So if you start to look at the wide variation in who managers interact with at work. Some people interact with their colleagues just within their own business unit. Others interact with folks across wide swaths of the organization. And what we're arguing here is that these differences in communication patterns will impact the things that they pay attention to, and therefore the things that employees will therefore speak up about. For the academics in the room, we're really relying on kind of two different theoretical traditions to help inform this. The first is around boundary spanning, and that the arguments here are that leaders really provide this filtering system between those individuals on the outside of their teams and outside of their business units, and they filter that information internally. And so if you're more locally focused just within your team versus having access to wide swaths of the organization, that's going to impact the types of things you attend to. And then secondly, this also goes back to some classic research in sociology on what's called cosmopolitans versus locals. And essentially the breakdown here is that cosmopolitans think about very different types of ideals and professional ideals and cultural ideals than those that are more locally attuned to the local issues of a particular organization or team, et cetera. So what we're arguing here is that some managers are more globally focused. That is, they have networks, they have communications that span across business units, across wide parts of the organization. And as a result, they're going to talk about things that are common across the organization. Things like culture and employee experience. And because of that, this attention of managers will then impact the attention of employees and hence their communication patterns. Do they start to push and propel their teams to interact with folks across wide swaths of the organization as well? And then lastly, by doing so, this should impact the types of things their employees and their leaders attend to, and therefore the types of ideas that are ultimately surfaced. So this word salad up front here is some of our hypotheses. So managers' communications outside of the business unit should impact the types of ideas that their employees actually surface, and specifically those around culture, around the things that are common across the organization. And this effect is really explained by the nature of the team interactions. How much do they then communicate across different parts of the firm? In contrast, other managers are more locally tuned. That is, they develop deeper networks, deeper communications just within their team. And therefore, they should attend to issues that just affect their team, things like performance or those issues that would disrupt or enhance their team's effectiveness. As a result, their team members should also interact much more tightly, just internal, and that should impact the types of ideas that are related, that they speak up, that are more related to their job. And that's what we hypothesize here. So their communications within the business unit should impact speaking up about job-related issues, and this is really explained by their team interactions. So what we did is we collected what we think are some pretty unique data. So these are about 1,300 teams, managers, and about 6,200 employees within a large technology firm. We were able to scrape some data from their internal servers to understand who they interact with in meetings, that is both face-to-face but also over video conference. So we can track who they are meeting with, obviously not what happens during the course of those meetings. And then we're also able to scrape information from email servers. And again, this is metadata, so we know who they email with and how often, but not necessarily the content or the text of those emails. And then from this, we can map out and separate how much of these communication patterns, both meetings and emails, are internal within the business unit versus outside. We're also able to link this up with some HR information about team size, reporting level of the manager. Obviously, if you move higher in the organization, you're going to have different sets of responsibilities. Manager's tenure, the average team tenure. And then one of the things that I was particularly excited about this particular study was that we're able to start to separate the different topics of voice. So speaking up about task-related issues versus those that are more about the climate or culture of the place. And then lastly, we have a couple other control variables in there around average job satisfaction or engagement and how open the manager is. So that could impact the likelihood that people will speak up to them. So first, I'm going to present this in pictures. I promise there's lots of regression tables in here too. So we have a team, a leader within the team, and then some other folks that are within that same business unit, but outside the team. And so what we found was managers that had more communications internally to the business unit, had teams that also had more communications internal to the business unit, and that impacted the likelihood that those team members would then express voice specifically about the task or the job-related issues. In contrast, there were other managers that were more globally focused. That is, they had a lot more outside the business unit communications. This also then impacted the extent to which their teams looked outside for their communications, and then ultimately impacted speaking up about topics that are related to the broader culture of the organization. So lots of regressions, which I'm going to skip through. And to me, some of the implications here, at least for the academics, is this shifts attention in a few what I think are fundamental ways. The first is to make this much more of a cultural issue. This is not about individuals and alone in deciding to speak up. This is created by a dynamic that's impacted by leaders. Secondly, it shifts away from the frequency of voice to then talk about the specific ideas and types of ideas, the topics that people bring up. And then lastly, most of research on voice really focuses on the dynamics that are internal to the team. So are you going to speak up to your boss? Who do you interact with within your team? And this also starts to bring to light the notion that people outside of your business unit, folks that you should interact with less often, actually have a material impact on your experience and therefore the types of issues that you notice as being more important. So lastly, we have some early implications for what we think practitioners should change. And the way I always like to think about this is different questions you all should be asking. So first is, do employees really speak up about different topics than what managers and leaders prioritize? Well, if that's the case, then perhaps you should look at who you interact with versus who your teams interact with and start to push them in different directions, depending on if you need more focus internally with job performance issues or you really want to talk about the broader climate. Secondly, for employees, do they know what their leaders are actually attending to? So they should pay attention to the types of meetings and the types of interactions their leaders have. And if not, then that's an opportunity to have some greater alignment around that. And then lastly, do managers really know the types of issues that are top of mind for employees? So if there is that mismatch, then perhaps it's not just the employee's fault. Perhaps it's the managers who need to adjust how they are interacting and the types of people that they interact with. So thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
It's great to be here. Thank you for organizing this. I was not here last year. I hope to be here next year, but it's been a great conference so far. I'm going to be talking about countries, culture, and collaboration. As you see, before I begin, a shout out to my colleagues and collaborators. Evan DeFilippis is a third-year doctoral student in the Organizational Behavior Department. He's fantastic, as is Madison Singel. She's my research assistant and is currently applying to doctoral programs. So for any of you academics on your doctoral admissions committees, take a good look, because she's fantastic. So I'm going to talk today about how national culture affects collaborative activity. I'm a micro-researcher. I study individuals and teams. But today I'm going to go up, way up, in levels of analysis to think about countries and their national cultures and how those affect the firms and people within those firms in those countries. I primarily study collaborative activity, as I mentioned, so I'm studying things like collaborative overload. Does too much collaboration actually, is it associated with declines in performance? Looking at organizational scaling. So how does collaboration scale? Do companies get more efficient or less efficient in collaborating as they get bigger? And related topics. But today I'm going to talk about culture and kind of return to that. And you may be asking, Jennifer, I'm sure you are, saying, Jeff, well, how did you get interested in culture? And I would tell you that it started in the last century when I was a third-year doctoral student. And an assistant professor in my department at Kellogg asked if I wanted to join a project to study organizational culture. Her name was Jenny Chatman. And we conducted a study with our colleagues Sigal Barsaid and Maggie Neal, where we set up organizational simulations and experimentally manipulated whether those simulated organizations had a collectivistic or an individualistic organizational culture. And then we studied the interaction among the 20 people in each simulated organization. And we looked at both face-to-face interactions and some of their written interaction. And found indeed that collectivism, I won't go into all the results, but collectivism had some powerful effects on the interaction of the people in those simulations. So today, in some ways, it's coming full circle quite a bit later, looking at this same issue conceptually, but in a very different methodological way. So the indicators of collaboration I'm going to talk about today are meetings and email. Meetings, I think, are especially interesting, and are worthy of study as a topic in and of themselves. So much of what we do organizationally occurs in meetings. And not only are they a way to get at interaction, face-to-face or over video or phone, but actual people interacting in organizations to conduct the work of the organization, they are fraught with dysfunction or potential dysfunction. So getting meetings right is a big deal. It's a way to get at all of those things that as social psychologists or organizational psychologists we think about in face-to-face interaction. What are the nonverbal signals? How do we have group discussions and make decisions? So much of that in organizations occurs in meetings, and they're costly. They're not free. Time is scarce, and we only have so many meetings we can attend. And both individually and organizationally. And so how we organize ourselves and make decisions about what meetings to go to and how to spend our time, it's very consequential, I think, for the performance of you as individuals, for teams, and for organizations as well. So it's a great topic. I'm excited to be studying this in a number of ways. And email, of course, is a lower context form of communication, but in some ways, it's cheaper, it's faster, it's efficient. You can think that you're reaching lots of people quickly. And if your inbox is anything like my inbox, there may be some issues in actually reaching the people you think you're reaching. But these are the two indicators of collaboration. I'll be focusing on meetings primarily, but we'll be looking at both of these. So, what are predictors of collaboration? What I'm going to be talking about today is national culture. For the purposes of this talk, I'll focus on collectivism. Let's just talk about a baseline hypothesis. Really simply, firms operating in more collectivistic countries, we're predicting will engage in more meeting activity and more email activity. They'll interact with their colleagues more. And the literature on collectivism supplies some rationale for that, some reasoning that we studied back in the day about how collectivism invokes concern for the collective welfare. And we think about the in-group that we're part of, and to the extent that the organization is our in-group, we think about how to engage with the other members of our kind of dominant group to achieve our goals, which in this case is the organization's goals. I won't get into this now, but we are thinking about how the choices about meetings or emails, like how do we choose what form of communication to engage in, going back to what's a richer form, a richer contextual way to communicate. There's some potential predictions there too. And at the end, we can come back. We're also looking at hierarchical cultures, national cultures, and also the tight-loose dimensions. So we can come back to that. Meeting activity, by the way, we'll look at meeting hours today, like just aggregate meeting hours. But we can think about lots of dimensions of meetings. How big do they tend to be? Firms differ in how big their meetings tend to be, how many people attend them. How long are they? Some firms tend to have really long meetings. Some have shorter meetings. There are lots of dimensions to meeting activity that we can also think about. Multinational firms are interesting because they allow the possibility, and many of you experience this, I'm sure, in your day-to-day work, of people's behavior being affected not only by their local culture, but also potentially by the national culture of other parts of their organization. So we're going to test the idea not just that a firm will be affected by its local culture, but also that a headquarters national culture may spill over and affect behavior in subsidiaries, and that this may depend on, for sure, the relative size of the subsidiary, among other factors. So we're going to look at national culture affecting firms within that culture, but also the possibility of those norms spilling over. So let's talk about the methods. The most novel thing that I'm going to talk about today by far are the data on meeting and email activity. So let me describe those first, and then we can talk about how we are going to test patterns of meeting and email activity. So I've partnered with a global company that offers an email and electronic email and calendar cloud-based platform. And we have worked, I think, thoughtfully and extensively together to put together a collaboration agreement to be able to use de-identified data aggregated to the firm level to look at some of the patterns across a large sample of firms across the world. We don't have any data on individuals at all. We simply have aggregate, for example, meeting hours for firms that the company has already aggregated to the level of the firm. And I'll talk more about what some of those specific measures are. The company, before giving us the data, also matched a lot of the data to Dun & Bradstreet variables, so we can look at things like industry, the founding year of the company by decade, which turns out to affect meeting and email behavior in 2016, and some other organizational attributes that Dun & Bradstreet provides. So in essence, unlike our simulation of 20 people, which has its own advantages methodologically, we're using digital data to measure collaborative activity at scale across the world. So for today, this is a subset of the data set. We're going to look at data that's aggregated for the full calendar year of 2016 for a sample of a little over 166,000 firms in 95 countries. And these are aggregated from around 12 million individual users. So these are only firms that have both email and meeting data. They're firms that could be matched with Dun & Bradstreet, et cetera. So it's a subset that we'll be looking at for today. So we're going to pair this meeting and email data with measures of country collectivism that have been used a lot in the literature based on Hofstede's work. Country controls like GDP from World Bank data. And firm controls like industry and founding year from Dun & Bradstreet. So a couple of the measures, collaborative behavior. So across all of these firms, the unit here is meeting hours per person per week. And the overall mean across the world is 3.8 meeting hours per person per week. You may be saying, I wish that were me. All right, and I get it, but it's interesting in talking to some of these that these metrics differ a lot across knowledge workers and others who use email and who have meetings but don't have nearly as many, depending on the function, where they are. So this is an overall mean, and across the world, mean email sent per person per week turns out to be 31.5. Collectivism quickly is on a 100-point scale. We've scaled so that higher score is more collectivistic. An example would be the US is 9, very individualistic on the scale. Guatemala, 94, very collectivistic. Control variables, I've mentioned number of employees in the firm with these user accounts for email and calendar, year of founding, industry, and some country indices. Okay. So, a map, here's the mean email sent is 31.5, but you see some of the variation across the world in terms of email sent per employee per week. And here's average weekly meeting hours with a mean of 3.81, but you see some of the variation across the world. And what I'm going to present now is a unabashed regression analysis looking at the effect of collectivism on meeting hours where the observations are firms. And let me put out a pitch. I know we're a mixed audience today. For those in organizations, if you're not doing regression analyses, I think you should be. And if you're saying, well, how do we do that? I think you should partner with an academic who can help you. In all honesty, I think these collaborations are where we are in 2020 there's fantastic opportunity. So here's I won't go into all the detail, but our measure of collectivism with the box slightly off. But we see that the collectivism of the country more collectivistic countries are associated with more meeting hours. Okay, so there is a pattern across the world in collectivism affecting meeting hours. This is only for domestic firms. So it's those firms that are in one country only. When we look at multinational firms, we actually see a negative effect. And by the way, this is moderate or affected by the number of employees. In fact, smaller firms have more powerful effects from the country culture. So the bigger the firm gets, the less it's affected by the country culture. So this is a fixed effect model. On the right, we see a negative effect, but it's interesting. We're going to go into this a bit because if you think about a subsidiary of a multinational company, as we discussed, it's affected potentially by its national culture. But the question is it also being affected by the cultures of its headquarters and maybe even other subsidiaries? So what we do is, just quickly, is we've subsetted the data to look at firms that are multinational but have only 2 locations. There are other ways analytically we're trying to get at this, but for today, think about a firm that has a headquarters in one country and a subsidiary in a second country. We're going to subset those, and it turns out there are 1,340 of those types of firms in the data set. And the headquarters and subsidiaries are spread across a high number of countries. And we're going to test this idea that the national culture of the headquarters, does it affect meeting behavior in subsidiaries? And so to do that, we run another regression. We see that the subsidiaries, in this case in individualistic countries, so we've subsetted it, their meeting hours are affected quite a bit by the collectivism of the country that the headquarters is located in. Okay, so if you're a subsidiary in an individualistic country and your headquarters is in a collectivistic country, that's affecting your meeting hours internally in your subsidiary location. In collectivistic subsidiaries, there's no effect. Okay, so there, and this, and Jenny, if you, in some ways it parallels the idea that not everyone is affected similarly. In this case, if the culture of the subsidiary affects their receptivity in some way of the culture of the headquarters. Okay. Emails have largely the same effects of collectivism that we saw for meeting hours. Okay, more collectivistic countries lead to more emails, more interaction. Meetings and emails are similar in that way. Same kind of effect for the headquarters collectivism affecting emails in the subsidiary. We've just quickly, we've looked at hierarchy. You get a more hierarchical countries have firms that spend more time in meeting hours. So the hierarchical nature of the national culture matters in terms of meeting hours. And then in terms of tightness, this tight loose dimension, these are preliminary results, but more tight countries elicit fewer meeting hours than looser countries. And we're going to look at a number of things to try to get at what's going on there. So last slide, there's a lot of potential in these data for sure, but I also think in this type of research, as we've seen from some of the other presentations in the conference. One thing we want to do is look at whether whether this collaborative overload issue, scaling issues, whether those depend on the countries they're in, and whether culture affects something like collaborative overload, and how big of a problem it is. We certainly want to link meetings and emails to organizational culture. So maybe there are possibilities for looking at things like Glassdoor reviews, as some people are doing, and linking that to the email and meeting patterns in organizations. Meetings and emails, but meetings in particular, there are a lot of dimensions to meeting data. So more hierarchical firms, which are more bureaucratic, have more recurring meetings. That's something we can test versus one-off non-recurring meetings. Are they scheduled further in advance in more hierarchical firms than more last-minute meetings? That's something we can test. How big, how long, how many meetings are there? Those all go into meeting hours. What's the distribution of meetings across employees within a firm? Is it equal, or is it skewed toward a subset of boundary spanners or managers and executives? We're looking at multitasking. Everything's time-stamped. So at an aggregate level, some firms, people in those firms send many more emails during their meetings than other firms. Okay, so it's a metric that you can aggregate to the firm level and say how much multitasking of that sort goes on in these firms. And then certainly going within firms, as Ethan was doing and as others have done, in which I'm working on some of that research too, to get much more at mechanisms and understand how the elements of the organization fit together to affect collaboration and effectiveness ultimately. That's all. Thank you very much.
If I could, Ethan, you want to come back up? And we need 3 chairs, guys. Thank you. No, I don't need a chair. Thank you. So we're going to jump into questions in a moment, but what I thought I would do is just take 3 minutes and summarize for you sort of how these papers illustrate this general domain of research in the social psychological area of culture. And these are 3 fantastic representations of what researchers do in what we call the micro domain, which is more focused on individual behavior, group behavior, and the mechanisms that go along with it. So really terrific papers, really the best of the social psychological approach. And also what you can see is a kind of methodological evolution and diversity to the papers. Jack focused on an experimental methodology. Ethan focused on sort of field methods with some archival data and social networks. And Jeff is tapping into one of the most exciting developments in culture research, which is digital trace data, which really enables us to draw large samples and draw very significant, conclusive evidence about sort of what the trends are. And of course, my very favorite finding of his is the multitasking finding, because I send lots of emails in my meetings. And I would say that there are sort of 3 things that you want to pay attention to, just to sort of categorize your thinking about this approach. One is that micro researchers are often focused on the antecedents of culture. What are the things that cause culture to emerge? And so we saw in Ethan's paper, he was looking at what leaders do in the organization that affect the norms that exist within that organization. I mean, this is a really fascinating and very indirect study that shows that leaders' level of local focus rather than versus external exposure influences the questions that employees are willing to ask. Are they more focused on their personal jobs, or are they thinking more about broader organizational issues? That's a very profound difference that he learns about just based on the leaders' network. So that's quite a difficult connection to sort of pull together. In Jeff's case, the antecedent is national culture, which is, of course, very, very distal, very hard to pinpoint. But he's showing that national culture, this enormous thing that affects us all in very subtle and intangible ways, actually affects how many meetings we have. That's a pretty incredible connection to be able to make with rigorous methodology. So there are lots of people out there that are doing work looking at the antecedents of culture. I will just say that one of the areas that I've been working on very timely is on narcissistic leaders and the role that they play in creating cultures in organizations. And let me just tell you, the news is not good. So this is a very active area of research and really fascinating. The second broad category has to do with the consequences of culture. And this is probably what we think about the most when we think about culture research is what impact does it have, how does it affect people? And all three of the papers had implications for the consequences of culture. So in Jack's case, he talked about how these particular norms, the peace norms, affect people's level of creativity within teams. And what's super interesting about his paper is that he wasn't even talking about obvious norms that are necessarily related to creativity. Notice that one of the most important and consequential norms that he talked about was individualism. Right? Individualism doesn't have any inherent relationship to how creative you are. But what he's talking about is the contextual setup, the independence of thought that people need in order then to start generating original ideas. So this is fascinating to be able to pull together a non-obvious connection about the context and the setup that you need to produce in order for people to be creative. Same with Jeff, right? The notion that that not only your national culture, but this new finding that I hadn't heard about where your headquarters has this sort of subtle effect on how collaborative people are being. And again, in Ethan's case, the local versus organizational focus. So that's a sort of second category of things to look at. And then finally, what's interesting about the papers is they do talk also about the properties of cultural norms. And there's a lot here, too, which has to do really with not even the content of the norms, but how strong the culture is or how the norms are distributed throughout the organization. And this is something that we all pay a lot of attention to as well. Jack's very snarky operationalization of voting people off the island, it's hard to know how he gets those through. We have this big process called our IRB, which makes sure that we don't abuse our subjects, and I don't know how. Anyway, people got voted off your island there.
They did. I bribed a few people.
Yeah, and that this, the strength of the norms itself is what's causing the effect on creativity and people's ability to generate ideas. So what I would just suggest to you is they're all such fantastic presenters that they made this seem very sensible and logical and like we would have known this all along. But these are really non-obvious findings and the kinds of things that researchers can uncover if given the data and the access and the partnership to work with you. These are really very non-obvious things that we have learned about culture, the effect on behavior, and I think it's a really great illustration of the way that research can dig a little bit deeper and find these insights that allow people to be more productive, people to be more creative, organizations to be more functional. So let me stop there and let's see what we've come up with for questions before I go to our technology version. Are there any burning questions with real voice, Morten?
I got a question for Jeff and one for Jack. Jeff, an amazing data set. I mean, it shows that OB is the new finance when it comes to data. Now, you don't have data on the company-specific culture. You have it at the national level. So your independent variable is at one level, analysis independent is on the other. What would happen, you think, if you had company-specific culture measurements, like on collectivism versus individualistic? Would it override, you think, the national culture effect? Mm-hmm. And finally, which country firms had the most meetings? I'd like to know the country, so I can avoid it. That's my then a question for Jack, but maybe you want to.
Yeah, let's go first.
Yeah, sure. I think my premise is that national culture works through organizational culture. You know, that organizations are explicitly or more likely implicitly adopting the norms of their context. But there's an interesting question, and you know, ask yourselves or ask each other, do you think your organizational culture reflects your national culture? I think a lot of times this is at work in ways that are taken for granted and not explicitly connected. But research like this, especially in multinational firms, I think may raise awareness of these possibilities and allow people to ask questions about, like, what are our norms versus your norms, and how are they affected by the culture? And I think global teams are one area where this would be fascinating to study as well.
So which country?
So which country? I got to look at the map. We've done a lot. I'll come back today with. Let me look at my computer.
And for Jack, have you? Right now, there are software applications being developed that actually can track these practices or behaviors in real teams. Like IBM Watson Group, for example, has an algorithm that tracks, you know, the distribution of participation and some of these other dimensions. So have you thought about taking your model out into the field, using that kind of software applications? And I think this would be very interesting for managers who are in the room today, because it means that you can actually have some measurement of what's going on in teams and give feedback to managers so they can modify their behaviors.
I would love to do that. So if anyone wants to collaborate with me on that, I would love to. Yeah, the answer is yes, I would love to do that. I'm not sure how it would be different, but I think it would be interesting to look. I have not done it, no. The work I presented is lab-based.
Right. Is it feasible, you think?
I think it is. I think what I've tried to do in all of the groups research that I presented is actually videotape interactions. So even though they're in the lab, we always videotape and code the behaviors as they're actually unfolding during the conversation. But I think it would be interesting to go into the field to look at how other contextual influences might sort of moderate some of these effects we've been finding in the lab.
Yeah, please.
I had a question for Ethan. You studied managers and then teams who were either more focused within their team or outside. Did you have any sense of which type of team was more successful on any kind of dimension? Which one, you know, is it better to, I can see the trade-offs of having a team who's focused within themselves versus teams who are looking more generally, and any sense of how their performance different?
Yeah, for the data we have, we didn't really have any data on performance, or both at the individual or at the team level. So what I can say on that is I think a lot really depends on the type of team, the type of feedback that a manager really needs in order to push things forward. So I don't, at least for these data, I don't have a great insight into how these impacted the things kind of downstream. What I can say is in a different study, we are starting to look at speaking up about task-related issues versus those that are more related to the mission or values of the organization as a whole. And those do seem to separate in terms of, this is in a national grocery chain, in terms of the metrics for those individual grocery stores. And in this case, because this is a pretty mission-oriented organization, those ideas that were attached to that mission seem to have a greater impact on some of the operational and financial metrics. But that would look very different in a place that isn't so mission-oriented. So there's a lot of contingencies, I imagine, that would impact some of this. But that's at least some preliminary stuff that we're starting to see.